Good morning, colleagues. Lovely to welcome you this morning to our 5th Senior Leaders webinar of the year. Really delighted that you're able to join us at this, I know, is such an extremely busy and stressful time for you. Really hoping that this hour will be some light relief, you know, and some time to sort of step back from the day to day and the hectic and big decisions that you're needing to make at the moment, and reflect on some different issues and some different things for us in terms of strategic leadership and moving things forward. In terms of Zoom, hopefully you're all relatively familiar with Zoom now, but if you could keep your microphones muted during the session, that just helps in terms of background noise. But please do, if you're happy and able to, leave your cameras on, because that's really supportive to Viv as she's talking, in terms of her getting some reaction from yourselves. The chat facility is there and available. If you want to make comments or ask questions, you can post them in there. I'm more than happy to put those questions and share those comments with Viv, either as we go through, if it's appropriate, or at the end of the session. I've spoken to Viv and she's happy to stay on just for a while at the end of the session if colleagues have got questions that they want to ask, but not in the full session. She's happy to stay on and we can have that conversation at the end if you're available too. I think that's all I need to say in terms of the functionality of Zoom. So I'm going to, without further ado, hand over to Viv Grant. I'm really pleased that Viv's with us today. Viv has spent 30 years of her career in the teaching profession, one of the youngest head teachers in the country at the time, and has since set up Integrity Coaching, where she supports head teachers and school leaders in terms of coping with the challenges that they're faced with, using this sort of approach, this coaching approach, in order to support individuals having been through headship and understanding the pressures and challenges that presents. And I think at this time, you know, we can all relate to that. She's a coach herself, an expert coach, obviously a public speaker, but also an author, and has written a book called Staying Ahead, which I think at this time again is a really interesting text, and I think will be something that you know, I would advocate for heads to look at if they feel that would be useful for them to look at the moment. So there's Viv. She's coming to talk to us specifically today about leading on race and identity work within schools, and she's done a lot of work with head teachers and schools across the country in terms of this theme. And we know that this is something that we need to address within schools, and so hopefully this will give us some food for thought in terms of how we can manage this best within our context. So I'm going to hand over to Viv now for the session. Thank you, Viv.
Thank you very much, Helen, and really lovely to be with all of you this morning, as much as it is virtual. Now, before I share my screen with you and take you through what I've prepared for you this morning, what I'm going to be asking is that you have to hand pen and paper or a notebook and because as we're going through this morning, in fact, when I start, I'm really going to be pausing at certain points. I'll be asking you questions to reflect on yourself. And I'd really encourage you to be thinking about your responses. As we go through, at one other point, there's a diagram that I'd like you to draw and begin to sort of fill in, because it will help you to engage with the material and the themes that I'm going to be sharing with you this morning. And also, particularly, if you have any questions at the end and want to stay on for the call, or, you know, for the bit when Helen and I are facilitating at the end, again, if you're taking notes that really help you to connect what I'm talking about with your own context, you'll find that helpful. So Helen's already given a bit of an introduction about myself, and I will tell you a bit more of my story as it relates to the theme around leading on race and identity as we move through today, or this morning, I should say. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now, and I'm just going to begin, as I said, by asking you to consider some questions. And so I want you to spend about 5 minutes, no more than that. And please do that. Spend some time reflecting on when you were at school. It doesn't matter. It can be primary or secondary. And I want you to consider what beliefs and decisions you are beginning to form about yourself as a learner, the role of the teacher, and the purpose of school. So just spend about 3 to 5 minutes just reflecting, try not to look at your phones or answer any emails, just because I've given you some time to reflect. But, you know, just do that. You know, don't need to be fully formed answers. They can be bullet points, but just spend some time doing that. Okay. And now, you know, if I was with you in a group or whatever, we'd have some discussion around these. But I'm going to be asking you another question now. And that question is looking at, you know, the views and attitudes you are forming about yourself as a learner, the role of the teacher, and the purpose of school. The question I'm going to ask you now is, and I'll put it up here, is, to what degree did race figure in your reflections, and what were you learning about race? And just spend a minute or so just jotting down your responses. Now, I know from having done this exercise with a number of teachers and senior leaders that very often, particularly if you identify as being white, very often the responses that I get to this is on a scale of 0 to 10. Most will say to me, you know what, Viv, it's probably around about 0 or maybe about 3. And then we then follow on and we explore that. Well, why was that? For some, it could have been because actually their schooling was very much in white dominated, you know, high population of white pupils, very much, you know, looking very much like themselves. Race wasn't discussed on the curriculum, or even if there were, you know, small percentage of, say, black pupils in the school, they were kind of like marginalized or not really ignored. The message was to assimilate. So then, you know, the question that I would ask, and again, if we were a group and I was there with you, we'd have a discussion. What were you learning about race? But it tends to be, we're learning that race was to be ignored, that race really wasn't important, particularly if you were white, that race wasn't something that was to be brought into the mainstream, and that race was something to do with individuals who looked like me. It didn't matter if you weren't black or a person of colour, then actually race didn't affect you. They were the messages. And so in the context of what I want to explore with you today, in terms of looking at race and what you need to consider when leading on race, I want you just to hold your responses to these questions in mind, because these questions that you've just spent some time reflecting on will help you to understand really your own starting position, where you are now, what the particular challenges that you might be facing, and the reasons as to why you might be facing those challenges. It's really important to also say there's no blame with this. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later about the way in which we are all socialized around race. But it's important, I think, for all of us, whether we're black or white, to know where we're starting from and to have a bit of an understanding as to why that is. So again, a question I have here for you, which you might want to note down your response. In the context of becoming race aware as educators, what does the proposition "we teach out of who we are" mean to you? You know, again, just put down your reflections, particularly in the context of becoming race aware. What does the proposition "we teach out of who we are" mean to you? Now, this quote comes from an author called Parker Palmer. I don't know if any of you are interested. He's a Quaker, but an educational activist in the States, which I think is in his 80s now. But two of his key books are A Hidden Wholeness and The Courage to Teach. And this one where he specifically talks about how we need to embody the role of being a teacher. And what Parker goes on to say is, the who, seldom if ever do we ask the who question. Who is the self that teaches? And this bit for me is so important within the context of race. How does the quality of my selfhood form or deform the way I relate to my subject, my students, my subject, my colleagues, my world. And what he's saying here, particularly within the context of race, well, my belief is we need to have a positive racial identity, particularly when if we see our role as really educating young people to be confident in who they are, to really be global citizens and to be very confident discussing race. What experience has taught me to date is that many teachers and school leaders, particularly if you're white, find this a really tricky and sensitive area. And it then shows up in terms of how, in a sense, they embody this work, how they engage with this work. And my argument is that all of us have a responsibility here. All of us are responsible for educating our young people, for ensuring that they can really fulfill their potential and be the individuals that we need them to be in the world. You know, a common thing aspect around schooling is that the racist and the anti-racist, they both went to school. So we really need to address them. What was happening in the classrooms? What was happening in leadership? Who were the teachers? Who were the leaders who showed up in front of them? And how did it either inform in a positive way the selfhood of the individual or actually impact in a negative way? And, you know, this is something that I think when we look at race and addressing it in school and leading in it, we're so quick to go to the curriculum, which is right, but very rarely do we actually look at ourselves. And that's partly why I believe we are where we are at the moment around the race debate, because it's been very easy. And I've been doing this race equality work for years and years. And, you know, looking back, I can quite confidently say what we always did was we always looked at what we thought was easy to action first of all. And that would normally be around behaviour policy, data, curriculum. But never did we go to what I call the core. And the core being, you know, asking that question, who am I? Then that second bit should be, what is mine, you know, who are we, i.e. in terms of leading with others? And then it should be the third circle, what is ours to do? And we've never done that. And that's why, you know, my emphasis in talking with you this morning is saying, again, if you imagine 3 circles, so the first circle is to do with selfhood, and it answers the question, who am I? And particularly around race, it's who am I in terms of my racial identity? Then it's a third circle, who are we? You are all leading in schools. So the key question you have to ask is, who are we, particularly as an SLT? And then widen it out. Who are we as the teaching body? Because you create the culture that your children come into. And you have to understand those bits first. And it's only when you get good grounding then can you go to the outer circle. What is ours to do? So as we move on then, you know, as I think I've said, you know, the who relates to who and how we have been socialized. And, you know, I really believe this. If we are to be teachers or, you know, leaders who teach and lead with integrity out of who we are, then it's really important that we understand how the process of socialization has shaped our racial and professional identities. And again, it's rare that we go to that place. It's rare that we stop and we actually think about, okay, myself as an individual, how have I been socialized to take up my position in this society? And particularly, you know, in terms of the role that we all have as educators. So I want to talk with you a little bit about racial socialization and how we learn, you know, how we learn to adopt the roles that have been assigned to us. You know, and we all know that race is a social categorization, but at the same time, it has an impact in terms of how we occupy our roles within society. So what we have here and what we know about race is that the process begins during childhood. And it's the process by which as individuals, we acquire values, habits, and attitudes of society, the society within which we're all born. And, as Bobby Harrow goes on to say, each of us at birth, we assign different sets of identities. And that's the whole debate around intersectionality. And these identities predispose us to unequal roles within the dynamic system of oppression. Now, that can be sometimes quite hard for individuals to hear. And we're going to be exploring a little bit why that is so. But it's really important to recognise we are then socialised by powerful sources, and they impact in terms of the way in which the roles that are being prescribed to us and how they impact upon us in terms of levels of equality and equity and what we experience, whether we are Black and whether we are white. And it's really important to actually, emphasize these key aspects about the socialization process. Very often, it is unconscious, and we're not aware the degree to which it's coming at us from all sides, from the media, from being at school, from going to church, from engaging with the health service, from engaging with the judicial, the legal system. It's there, it's interwoven. It's patterned and it is predictable and it's consistent. I'll be sharing with you in a moment a diagram of the socialization cycle, and it's self-supporting, and I'll talk to you as to how that works and why that happens. It's interdependent, and as I've already said, and which is the bit that can sometimes make it very difficult for us when we're engaging with this work. It's unconscious and unnamed. And as we become more articulate and literate around addressing race, particularly as school leaders, it's the unconscious and the unnamed bit that we need to become familiar with. So now this is the bit where I really will need you to have your pen and paper to hand, because I'm going to take you through the socialization cycle. But I want you to relate it to yourself. So I'm going to talk it through to you in relation to my own experience as a Black woman. And as I go through each stage, I'm going to be inviting you just to reflect on it in relation to yourself. So just to sort of, that's an overview of it. You don't need to draw this one just yet. But, it's important to recognise that we get systematic training in how to be each of our social identities. So whether that's around our ethnicity, our race, our gender, our economic status. And all the time this is going on throughout our lives, through this cycle of socialization. And this model that I'm going to share with you is just one way of representing how the socialization process happens. So this is where I'm going to need you to have pen and paper to hand. I'd like you to draw this model, please. So that first circle, and draw it so it's big enough for you to write in. And that's the beginning. Then you've got that second arrow. That second arrow has actually got a label missing above the top of it. It should say the first socialization. So I'd like you to write that above the first arrow, and then just all the other bits that you see on the diagram. So the circles, the arrows, the labels that are there. Okay, so I'm hoping you've all done that. So I'm going to take you through this cycle of socialization. How I'm going to do it is, I'm going to take you through each bit, starting with the beginning. I'm going to tell you how that related to my life. I'm going to give you an example. And then I'm going to ask you a question and give you a couple of minutes to answer that question. So that first circle is the beginning. And that beginning is when we come into the world. Racism already exists. None of us were born at a time when racism didn't exist. There were already messages out there about what it meant to be Black, what it meant to be white. We had no choice in terms of racism and where we were born. Already racism had been set in motion. Now for myself, the beginning, the world in which I was born into, I'm a child of the Windrush generation. My parents came to this country in the 1950s. And what they experienced, the world that I was born into, was a world of much trauma and sadness. By the time that I came along, my mum had already had a couple of nervous breakdowns as a result of a number of things of coming to this country and experiencing the level of racism that she faced. And that was the world that I was born into. And we already know from the work of psychologists and neurologists that as young children, before we even can begin to speak and have cognitive processes by which we make sense of the world, we embody a lot of what the messages from our environment. And so for me, as a child born in the 60s, that's the environment that I was born into, not conscious of, but bodily, I would have begun to pick up messages around what it meant to be Black. And so my question for you is just very simply, what was happening in the world or in your family context around race in the era in which you were born? Just a very simple question. And of course, cognitively, you wouldn't have been aware, but your parents, your caregivers would have been. So just, note down what was happening in your world at the time of your birth, what's happening in the world around race at the time of your birth. Okay, and then we move on to the next arrow, which is the first socialization. Now, the first socialization, that comes from our parents, our families, our loved ones. And at that time, we'll be becoming aware of what are the racial scripts that are being passed on to us. And what are the rules for engaging with our own identities in the world? Now, the feedback that I get from working with white teachers and senior school leaders is that very much in their environments, the messages that they absorb would have been in terms of who were their parents' friends, who were the people their parents socialized with, what were the things their parents watched on TV, how did their parents comment in terms of things that came up around race, and so forth. And very much we know, sociologists tell us that for some individuals in relation to being white, the benefits of being white were probably ignored. But actually, they were beginning to observe, okay, this is what it means to be in the world if you're white. And maybe they were discouraged from seeing race. Also in that first socialization, we get very clear messages about how you behave in public, how you are to show up. So for myself, my first socialization, my main caregivers were my mum and my two older sisters. I learned some very strong messages from my mum about what it meant to be Black and female in the world. And I will revisit these later when we come to the inner core. But what I learned from my mum was to survive as a Black woman, you have to be strong and you can't show your emotions. I learned from my mum that the world is very unfair and that actually you always have to be on your guard. I can recall times, well, actually, fortunately, there weren't that many, but one or two, my mum used to work in the clothing industry and used to work in the West End in central London. But one or two times when she was just told, her job was no longer, there, and then found herself looking for work, no rhyme or reason given. And I just remember the stress of those experiences. And so these were the things. And my mum never said to me consciously, Viv, as a Black woman, this is how you're gonna have to be. This is what it means to survive. But that's what I learned from observing her, from watching her, to survive as a Black woman in this world. So they were some of my experiences of my first socialization. So the question to you is, from your caregivers, from those who are close to you, whether it was your parents, whether it was your siblings, whether it was grandparents, what were you learning in terms of your own racial identity about what it meant to be white in the world? Just jot down under the first socialization. What were you learning? And then we move on to the second circle, which is institutional and cultural socialization. And this is really where the messages or the scripts that are being enforced at home around race begin to be enforced. And this is really, or reinforced, I should say. And this is mainly through schooling. If as I've mentioned before, church, it can be through the health service, it can be through the legal system, the media, but this is where messages around race and who we are in terms of our racial identity, we begin to get a sense of this. And I want us here, because we're all educators here, to focus on what it meant for us in terms of our school experience. So you can relate this back to those first questions I gave you, but also our teacher training. So I'll tell you what it meant for me. So at primary school wasn't too bad. Primary school, I went to a mixed primary school, and I would say actually the messages that I got about primary school was actually in terms of being a young Black girl, you could learn, you were fine, you weren't treated with any level of discrimination. It was a very, very different story when I got to secondary school. And it took me a long time to really get over the damage and the scarring for myself at secondary school as a result of discrimination and racism. So at secondary school, there are a number of incidences that were peppered throughout my time. I remember one incident, talking in class, as teenage girls do, and I was told by my art teacher to go outside and swing on the trees and eat bananas like my friends and relatives, the monkeys, do. Another time, our careers teacher asked me, or asked all of us, what did we want to be when we left school? It was okay when Kieran, who was white and a boy, said, "Sir, I want to be a journalist." It was okay when Jeffrey said, "Sir, I want to be a doctor." That was fine, brilliant, you can aspire to that. And when it came to me and I said, "Sir, I want to be a nursery nurse," I was told that was too high an aspiration and that instead I should consider going and being a cashier in the local supermarket. Now, if you reflect back to what I told you about my own upbringing, there was nowhere I could take that. I absorbed that hurt and that pain. I didn't tell my mum because what I had already learned in the first socialization was you got to be strong. The world is a harsh place. And actually, when people talk to you, show you discrimination or prejudice, you don't show it. You hold all your emotions inside. So for me, secondary school was a place which really enforced that if you were Black and working class as I was, then actually you were not going to get fair treatment. You were going to be discriminated against. It didn't really get much better when I went to teacher training college. And there are probably two things that stand out for me at teacher training. One was, if ever any of you have come across the work, he's dead now, of a Ghanaian educationist called Bernard Coad, and he wrote, what was it called now? How the education system makes the West Indian child educationally subnormal. Yeah, very long text. And I remember in one of my lectures, and I was the only Black student, which again, for me, in terms of, messages around race, I found that very difficult to deal with. But at the same time, I remember our lecturer talking and sharing details of this book with the students, trainee teachers. And all I remember was I just wanted to sink. I just wanted to pull away, and I just wanted to hide, because she was sharing with them, which had been a reality of my schooling. But for all the other students there, this was just, academic, something to be studied, not necessarily something to be taken seriously. But again, in that instant, messages were being conveyed around race and how we discussed race and who it really impacted on. And I loved that tutor. I know it wasn't her intention, but for me, very much the message was a sense of almost othering. If you're Black, racism is something to be addressed because it impacts upon you negatively in the system. At that time, there was no real addressing of actually, if you're white, what do you need to do so that you can address racism and ensure when you become a teacher, when you become a school leader, that actually this is not perpetuated. Another thing that also really stood out for me at teacher training was that studying multicultural education, as it was called at the time, was an option. It wasn't central. And I'm sure you can guess. So when it came to choosing our options, I remember it's only myself and I think 3 or 4 other white students that chose that option. And it was, and I remember at the time they were saying, because so few of us had chosen the option, they weren't sure whether they could actually deliver it, but the tutor was determined that it would go ahead. But again, very clear messages were sent out through my teacher training. It's marginal. You put it to one side. It's not really central, even though most of those people that I trained with were going to teach in multicultural urban environments. And yet the message they were given, it wasn't important. And so now again, the question I want to put to you on that second circle, to what degree did your own experience of schooling, and you've probably answered that with the first exercise, reinforce messages about your own racial identity? And think back to your teacher training. To what degree did your teacher training reinforce messages around your own racial identity? Okay, and so then we move to enforcement. Now, at societal level, enforcement is really interesting because really these are the rewards and punishments that are meted out by society in relation to the degree to which, I suppose, we challenge what we see to be unjust. And again, this is very, very subtle, but it's also part of the reason why we are where we are now around the race dialogue. So very often it can be, some of the rewards might be, if you don't speak out and you don't challenge, the message that we get is actually, it's okay. You still feel as though you belong and that it's all right. And I know, speaking to a number of colleagues, when we've reflected on this, they're like, oh my God, Viv, I hadn't realised that. For so long around the race debate as a white person, I thought it was okay to be quiet, and it was okay but now I realise actually in terms of how racism works, that whole network and so forth, my keeping quiet actually was kind of like a reward I got, because actually it meant I didn't need to shake anything up. I didn't need to look at myself. And equally, the reinforcements are there if you're Black. If you're Black, the message that you get is actually, if you don't rock the boat, it's okay. And I know that's the message I got all throughout my schooling. And actually, I'm not going to go into it. Well, can I go? I'll give you one small example. I don't know, on another talk, I share my story about when I became a head teacher. But I'll just share this as an example for you around enforcement. So the school where I became head teacher, the school was in special measures when I took it on. And it was it served a predominantly Black community, but the majority of the teachers were white. And before I took up the headship, I was a support teacher before I actually moved up the ranks to become head teacher. And I remember one of the incidences where it was said, I'm just trying to think which one to share with you. There are so many, but I was in the staff room and I was leading, that's right, an inset and equal opportunities. And I remember, and it breaks my heart even to share this with you, one of the teachers describing the Black boys in their school as being gorillas. And I just didn't know what to do. I know what I did. I went to the toilets and I cried. But then, even then, the message is being there for me, Viv, the more that you do this work, the harder it is and the more resistance you're going to get. And so the enforcements were either, Viv, you either continue to speak out, but no, it's going to be really difficult. Or sometimes you're just going to have to choose not to. And in the literature around, the cycle of socialization, what we understand is Black and white, we adopt coping strategies. And those coping strategies then feed into the results. And these are really the results that we experience. And they're experienced on a societal level, and they're also experienced personally. So, actually, I didn't ask you that question. I'll put that question, but I'm aware of time and I've still got so much more to do with you. But the question you would ask yourself around enforcements is, how have I been rewarded or not rewarded through the system in terms of my own racial identity? Now, as I said, the enforcements and the way in which they impact, they actually then cause us to adopt coping strategies. So, and we experience them individually, and then they are played out in society. So we all know the results and how they're played out in society, because it's why we are where we are now. For myself as a Black woman, my coping strategies were times I'd just be really, really strong, like my mum. Other times I would over-adapt. And so by over-adapting, what I would do, if I was in an environment where it seemed that my skin colour, my presence made other people feel uncomfortable, I would acquiesce. I would ensure that people felt okay around me. And these are things that very often, Black people, I don't think we've very often shared what our coping strategies have been. But again, as part of this dialogue, it's really important. And so my question would be for you, and I'm not going to ask you, just because of time, but what have the results been for you in terms of your own racial identity and working through the cycle of the socialization? What have they been for you? And then the final arrow is continuation. And really continuation, it doesn't really, I'm sad to say, need any active or any action from us on our part, because the cycle of socialization is so deeply embedded within our social structures, within our organizations. It has a life of its own, and it just continues. And some people could argue, but Viv, how can that be? Then I just say, well, look, particularly around race, we just need to look at where we are now. Because if this wasn't having an impact, and if it didn't have a life of its own, I wouldn't be having this talk with you this morning. I wouldn't be sharing any of this with you. And, we go straight to that middle bit now, the inner core. And what we know through all this work is that actually, because of the way socialization works, and particularly around racial identity, it leaves individuals with a mixture of feelings. And some of these can be conflict, some of it can be guilt, some of it can be fear, some of it can be ignorance. The way that I like to pose it with the inner core, I just say, actually, it leaves a divided self. And it goes back to one of the points I made earlier about why it's so key that around race, we know how to lead and teach out of who we are. as Helen shared with you earlier, a lot of our work is around coaching school leaders to be the best that they can be. And there's this whole sense around how do we lead as someone who is whole? And I'm of the firm belief, whether we are Black or whether we are white, that inner core, we cannot be whole. We cannot lead as our best selves if we don't have a strong, positive racial identity, because our sense of self impacts upon those who we are engaging with day in and day out. Another colleague of mine says, that whenever we're in the classroom or whenever we're with a fellow educator, we're actually having an encounter. And that's more to do with they're having an experience of who we are. It's not so much the subject and the content, it is who we are. So I want to leave you with that. And if you've got any questions around exploring that later, I'm more than happy to answer them. But I want to move this on now. And really, I just want to share with you this quote by James Baldwin. And I hope what I've shared with you just prior to this will help you to really understand this quote and make sense of it. James Baldwin said, because he's dead now, that education occurs in a context and has a very definite purpose. The context is mainly unspoken and the purpose very often unspeakable. But education can never be aimless and it cannot occur in a vacuum. And, in light of what happened, in May of last year with the death of George Floyd, and again, I haven't spoken to all of you about that. I'm just going to go back because one of the things I should say, hang on, in relation, now why isn't it going back in the way in which I want to say? Okay, in relation to this cycle, the continuation, there is a way out, which again, I'm not going to explore with you on the talk today. Well, actually, I will a very little bit, but there is a way out. And there's another cycle called the cycle of liberation. And it's almost when something happens that jolts us out of the everyday and we begin to see that things need to change. Now, for me, as much as I've been around this work around race equality, something happened for me with the death of George Floyd, which really calls to me engage with this cycle of socialization in a very different way. And I suppose now enter into that cycle of liberation, but I don't have time to talk to you, but I just talk to you about that. But I don't want you to be leaving you thinking, oh my God, is there nothing I can do about this? No, there is. And it's probably most certainly why you're all on the call this morning, which is about recognizing, okay, there has to be another way forward. So just wanted to say that. So education occurs in a context. So we have to begin to exploring now as a way to move forward. If we know that the context has been around that racism has existed for yonks, and that when James Baldwin speaks about, very often it's been unspeakable, what he's been talking about there is the way in which race has been ignored. It is about the way, particularly if you're white, it's been unspeakable because racism does not want you to face up to the fact that actually there are benefits and it's okay that there are benefits and that you benefit from the system of racism. It doesn't, the system at large doesn't want us to necessarily engage with it. You'll probably notice, or you may have noticed over time, that when we start to really raise Black underachievement and so forth, very often what will come on the back of that is, oh, what about the white working class boys? And what we need to recognize here is that actually, and we need to be very attuned to this, that only comes into the dialogue when the decision makers and those who hold power begin to feel threatened. What we also need to recognize is that it's a way to sort of divide and rule. We need to recognize that, if you're working class, the system works against you. But, so we just really need to be very understanding how nuanced the whole debate can be. But I want to move us to, very quickly, because I can't believe how quickly time has gone, to how do we begin to move forward with all of this then? What are some of the key points that we need to be looking at? And for me, the way I'm going to do this with you is by looking at educational theory and pedagogy and what has shaped our education context. And the question I have here for you, what is the soil out of which we have been born as educators. Because I believe, if, going back to that circle on the socialization cycle, the beginning, and that's when we were born into this world. But how about if we were to think about that in terms of, okay, the beginning for us as educators, what is the soil out of which we were born as educators? Now, if we can begin to understand this, we can then begin to say, okay, this is how we as educators can begin to change and can begin to lead all of this work around race and identity in our schools. So what I'm going to share with you is then it's not just me, it's my colleagues also within integrity coaching. But what we share with the schools that we work with is something that we call the educational soil and the learning continuum. Essentially, what you need to understand about these are essentially models that people have developed over time to help us understand how education occurs. And I've got a summary of them here, and then I'm going to go to almost like a lightning speed tour with you around each of them and some of the implications around race as well. So essentially, we start off if we start with liberal, technological, humanist, progressive and radical. You have the arrow there because the arrow starting with liberal, the emphasis mainly is more around content. And as we move up the continuum, process, i.e. how groups learn together, become important. Now, for all of us, this is the soil out of which we have been born as educators. It may not have been explicit, but as I go through each of the models with you, you'll begin to get some understanding of how they have formed and shaped us as educators. So what you need to understand about the circle diagram, that circle diagram explains the dynamic that is in operation within each of these learning theories. So with the liberal, what you have, the yellow dot is the teacher, and that's where the power lies. The blue is kind of like the mass of pupils together. We will all be familiar with this. And it's probably, if we look back to our teacher training and probably some of what's delivered in our curriculum at the moment, we have the yellow dot, the educator, and the title you probably give is they're the academic. And you have the teacher, the learners all grouped together. And very much it's kind of like an unspoken contract. And that contract is, I teach, i.e. I teach and you learn. And because content is king and I am content rich as the educator, you're going to learn bags and bags and bags of information from me. And that bags and bags of information that you learn from me is going to set you free. It's going to set you free from ignorance. It's going to allow you to be the individuals that you need to be. And again, this may not have been made explicit in our classrooms or through teacher training, but it will have been one of the sort of learning theories or modules that we would have been introduced to. Particularly when we think about, we're told, your subject is important. You really need to be on top of what you are teaching. The next one is technological. Now, this has come to dominate our profession. We know this, even if it has not been explicit. With technological, what we know is data is key. We know that standardization is key. We know that testing is key. We know that accountability is key. We all know this one. It hangs heavy, particularly in terms of Ofsted, over us. And what we understand here, when we look at the model, that the teacher is the expert. And almost the contract the teacher has with the learners is, I accredit and you meet the criteria. And the learners are seen as the apprentice. It's almost as though they've got to, not as almost as if, it is as if they need to learn a new skill, perform something, and they are judged on their ability to acquire this new skill, to perform well. So whether that's learning an instrument, whether it's doing GCSE maths, whether it's SATs, we as the educators are in that position where we're saying, this is the criteria against which you will be judged. And so it's really important then that you understand and you learn from me the technical expertise in order for you to perform well. And again, if you think back to the questions that I asked you at the very beginning, I'm sure you've been able to identify with those teachers, and also what you're beginning to understand about the purpose of education, how some of these models might have been active or live in your own schooling experience. The third one is humanist. And now I can say, I know for myself as an educator, this is the learning theory or model that I closely relate to. This is very much to do with personal growth. And I would hope that all of you in education, didn't happen to me till very late, actually, until I was at teacher training college. As much as it was really awful, I had one or two lecturers who, for me, this is where they saw me as being different from the group. And that's what that model represents, where yellow, you've got the educator, and suddenly you're differentiated from the mass of other students. They see something special in you and they want you to grow. They want you to be the best that you can be. And this is where very much then the educator becomes the guide from the side. They're drawing out, they're pulling in. And even though I haven't met any of you until today on this call, I'm pretty certain most of you will have uttered these words to students. You know what? I really want the best for you. I want you to be the best that you can be. I can see the gold in you. That has echoes of this humanist approach, where really we're saying, okay, yes, I may be the educator here. Oh, but there's magic inside of you. And I'm just working with you from the side to pull it forward. Then the next one, I think I'd imagine all of you here would have some relationship with this, the progressive. And this was one that, Gove and other sort of, government ministers sought to shut down. This was where very much, this was student-centered, pupil-centered learning. We were going to focus on our students, what they brought in. We were going to let them be the guide. We were going to trust that actually children, weren't empty vessels. And there were many things that they could bring into the learning environment. So this was about discovering how to solve real life challenges and problems. And the educator, as you can see here, is more the facilitator. The learner becomes the problem solver. And very much the contract here is I facilitate the experience of discovery for you. And then finally is radical. Now, you don't normally see this in schools because this really is more to do with adult education, because here what we have is where the power shifts. And actually, the educator and the learners, they almost have kind of like equal status and they are co-creating. So very much I know as a facilitator, when I am working with adults, I will work more towards this end. Yes, I have some knowledge, but I'm more concerned about facilitating process and how we are working together as a group. Now, as I said, this is just to give you an overview of like the soil out of which we have been born as educators. With each of these learning theories, there is nothing intrinsically wrong with them. I want you to hold that in your head, okay, because this is important. They can be done really, really well. And when we're in the classroom and we're seeing our teachers, we know when these learning theories are really have influenced and shaped our teachers, and we see good teaching and learning taking place. Equally, we know when they're done disastrously, and we know the impact that we can have. However, the point that we are at now is, and at the point that's very much being with teacher education and training, all of these have been race neutral. And it's once they start to they're put into action and we become more aware that they then have implications. And this is very quickly in the last 3 minutes where I want to take you to. So there's a question here. You're not going to have time to answer it or discuss it, and I'm going to give you the responses to them. But the question being, how might any one of these learning theories inadvertently contribute to race neutral or colourblind learning experience for young people? And what steps could be taken to address this? So very quickly then, starting from the liberal upwards. So what we need, and this is where most schools have started, and I understand that. So what we know with the liberal theory or learning model, content is king, and we know that there's been a great push now for decolonization of the curriculum. So it is more reflective of society, and there's more an understanding of Black history within that. However, what hasn't been key, which is which I feel so strongly about, is that we have not supported school leaders and teachers to think about the racial identity of teachers and how they seek to teach and lead out of who they are. Because as far as I'm concerned, there's no point decolonizing the curriculum if we still have teachers who are uncomfortable discussing race, who aren't clear about their own racial identity. Remember, the hidden curriculum has just as much power as what is said that is overt and explicit. Then we have moving up, technological. What do we need to address there? I hope this won't be new to any of you, but we just need to make sure that we're analysing our data and looking for any discrepancies there. What is our data telling us? When we look at humanistic, what we need to be sure they're aware of there is that if there's any unconscious bias, it's not seeping in and impacting in terms of preferencing or discounting of others. Progressive, I really haven't got time to talk about this in much detail, but just to say we miss a golden opportunity in terms of this particular approach when it comes to helping our young people and actually our teachers and our peers become confident around discussing race. Because this approach, where actually the teacher sees all the individuals as separate, can be where, and it's to do with discovering learning, this is where we can facilitate discussions around race. This is where we can actually develop what I say, this new muscle. But we do have to be clear that in doing that, it's not reinforcing racial stereotypes. And then finally, radical. And as I said, we rarely see this in classrooms, but it does have application in terms of thinking about what does senior leadership look like. It does have application when I said to you about that outer circle, the second circle, who are we? Who are we? Because this is where, as SLT, you can look at yourselves and begin to think, well, are we representative of society? When children come into school, what are the messages that we are sending out in terms of people who hold authority and power in the schooling system? It is 11 o'clock. So I'm just going to end with 2 final slides now. I'm not going to read through all of them, but just this point here, just take a note. And I'm happy to send these PowerPoints to Helen. So Helen, you can share them with the group. But just make note of what it means to have a positive racial identity and really be thinking about where are you in relation to all of these points. I know with the work that we've been doing with schools around this, that one of the key things heads and deputies have said to me is like, oh God, Viv, I realise at the centre of all of this is about if I can have a healthy relationship with myself, and normally it is as a white school leader, then Viv, I'm going to be so much better then at developing relationships of meaning and authenticity with others, whether they are white or Black. And my final slide here is really, I just want you to know that you're shaping the future for our young people. And, the question that I'd want you to be pondering at the end of this is, how will you be a good ancestor? If we want to be good ancestors, we should show future generations how we cope with an age of great change and crisis. And I think none of us can deny that this is where we are right now. It's not just the pandemic of COVID. It is the pandemic of racism as well. And I think we all have an obligation here to say, well, what is mine to do and what's the difference we can make? So I appreciate it has been a whirlwind overview. But if there are any questions, I'm going to, I'll stop sharing now. But I'm more than happy just to stay on for a few moments to answer any questions that you might have. That's it, Helen.
Thank you so much, Viv. There was so much there in terms of real food for thought for us to consider in our roles, and thinking about how we are within our current roles and what that brings to what we do and how we act. And and how that influences our own schools. So thank you for that. And then, you know, those really interesting theories of learning, and there's huge amounts that we could spend time considering those. And I know that colleagues have put into the chat that they would be really keen to see your slides so they can reflect on those things further with staff within school. And I think that would be really important as an outcome for today. So thank you so much for being with us, Viv. Obviously, you know, if colleagues have got questions or want to have a conversation with Viv now about some of the things that she's covered, obviously we're slightly over time now. So if you do want to stay on and you have got some time, then that would be great. I'll post in the chat as I do a link to our feedback form. Really useful, as always, to get your feedback in terms of these sessions. Particularly talk to me about how we can move things further from here, how we can develop some of these things further, thinking about into the summer term and where you are in your world and in your practice as senior leaders at the moment, and how we can support you through our summer term events and sessions, whether those are probably likely to be online still, but whether we can come back face to face. Please do share your feedback, because this is the point at which I'm thinking about those at the moment. But a huge thank you to Viv for being with us today and for sharing that. You've got so much passion, and you really have given us some inspiring messages to take away. So thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today. I hope you found the session useful. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Our 6th webinar for senior leaders is coming up on the 17th of March, and that's with Tom Rees from the Ambition Institute, looking at expert school leadership and developing school leadership during this time. So please do join us for that if you can, and hope to see you again soon anyway. Thank you ever so much. Please stay on if you can now. Thank you.